Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Oxford Energy Society's 6th-week talk. Today, we are joined by Martin Keuppers and Leonie Staas from the IEA to discuss a World Energy Outlook and the IEA scenarios. So Leonie is an energy analyst at the World Energy Outlook team. She's focusing on climate impacts and the role of behavioural changes in the energy transition. And this includes a focus on the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario and the Net Zero Emissions Scenario. Martin is also part of the World Energy Outlook team, part of the modelling team for the industry sector, and a geospatial expert for energy access topics. And prior to his arrival at IEA, he also worked for more than 3 years in the Central Energy System modelling team at Siemens, where he was involved in several internal and external consulting projects. Martin and Leonie will be giving us a presentation, and at the end of that, there will be some time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the comments on either Facebook or YouTube, and we'll have time to come to them at the end. So thank you so much, Martin and Leonie, for being here today, and I will hand over to you.
Thanks very much for the introduction. I will kick off and share the slides. This should be it. Let me know if that works. Can you see the slides okay?
Yes, we can see them.
Perfect. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having us this afternoon. Really looking forward to speaking to you and presenting and discussing with you afterwards. My name is Leonie. I'm presenting today with my colleague Martin. We both work for the World Energy Outlook team at the International Energy Agency, and we'll be speaking to you today about the results of the World Energy Outlook 2021 and the IEA and the scenarios in more general. So to start with, for those of you who might not be too familiar with the IEA and the World Energy Outlook, just a brief introduction to it. So the IEA works with governments and industry, and our goal is to shape a secure and sustainable energy future. The IEA was founded in 1974, and we're taking a so-called all fuels, all technologies approach. We have at the moment approximately 300 staff members from more than 40 countries, and we're based in Paris, in France. And the IEA is really at the heart of international energy dialogue. So every 2 years, we have energy ministers from IEA member countries and beyond convening, as well as high-level industry representatives meeting in Paris and discussing their views on energy issues and setting priorities for the IEA. And the World Energy Outlook in particular is the flagship publication of the IEA. It's appearing every year since 1998, and it's a very important source of analysis and projections. So the projections of the World Energy Outlook, or what we call it WEO, are derived from the World Energy Model, or WEM, and that's a large-scale simulation model, and it's been undergoing development since 1993. Happy to speak a bit more about the WEM and our assumptions later on if there are listeners who are interested in that. And in the WEO, we try to provide insights to regional energy prospects, the environmental impacts of these, the effects of policy actions, and also on technological changes. We publish the WEO annually, but we also have special reports, and especially in 2021, we published some important WEO special reports. So these focus on particular topics, but using the World Energy Model. So, for example, in May 2021, we published a Net Zero by 2050 roadmap, and there we analyzed how the world can achieve net zero emissions by the middle of the century. And we considered the growing concerns on climate policy among our member countries in particular. So a few words about our scenarios. We have 4 different ones present in the latest edition of the World Energy Outlook. First, the STEPS, or stated policy scenario. This one reflects the current policy setting based on a sector assessment. So in this scenario, we are not taking for granted that governments will actually reach their different targets and announced goals. Instead, we really explore what is backed up by concrete policy. So the goal of this scenario is really to kind of act like a mirror for governments and to benchmark their potential achievements and limitations of the policies they have in place. Next, we have the APS, or announced policy scenario, sorry. And this scenario, we assume that all climate commitments made by governments around the world will be achieved in time and in full. So that includes net zero targets, but also updated nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. So both the steps and the APS are not designed to achieve a particular outcome. Rather, they take a granular look at existing policies or targets and then see where they take us. And the remaining difference between the steps and the APS we call the implementation gap. So what needs to be done in terms of implementing policy to reach the announced goals. So the goal of this scenario is to show how close governments are to the target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, or how far they are actually. So the next scenario is the SDS, Sustainable Development Scenario. Here we take a kind of utopian approach, trying to set out for a specific goal of a well below 2 degrees pathway. We also assume in this scenario that all energy-related SDGs are met. So that includes things like universal energy access or lower air pollution. And lastly, we have the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, or NZE. And this one sets out a narrow but achievable pathway for the global energy sector to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And this includes advanced economies reaching net zero even earlier. We also meet the key energy-related SDGs in this scenario as well. And this scenario is not relying on any emissions reductions outside the energy sector, like offsets outside the energy sector. This one is the only one consistent with limiting global temperature-wise to 1.5 degrees without an overshoot. So to sum this up, we have two types of scenarios. The first one, steps and APS, are exploratory in the way that we define starting conditions and see where they take us, while SDS and NZE are normative. So we design them to achieve a specific outcome. All have the same economic and demographic assumptions, but we take different pricing and policy assumptions. So let's start looking at the results. So for the last 20 years, we saw global CO2 emissions on the rise. And since the Industrial Revolution, these emissions have already warmed the Earth by more than 1 degree. And looking back at our baseline, before the Paris Climate Summit, we saw continued emissions growth out to 2050. And this would really have led to catastrophic levels of climate change of at least 3.5 degrees by the end of the century. Just to illustrate what that would mean, the IPCC Assessment Report 6 has analyzed that this level of warming would increase the frequency of devastating heat waves 5 times, just to give one example. So this would really be an unlivable Earth. But we now see a different picture emerging, thanks to new policies since the Paris Agreement, and thanks also to technology cost reductions and also the economic impacts of the pandemic. So as mentioned earlier in the steps, we include all the latest legislated policies and regulatory targets, but it does not include the net zero pledges or updated NDCs. So in the steps, as you can see on the slide, we see near-term peak in emissions around 2026 and then a slow decline after that. But even though this has allowed us to reduce temperature projections by the end of the century by 1 degree to 2.6 degrees, this is still really far away from the targets of the Paris Agreement, and it would still risk catastrophic climate change. So in the last year or so, countries accounting for up to 70% of global emissions have announced net zero targets, and 120 countries also submitted new and updated NDCs. And if we assume these will be met in full and in time, then we see a different emissions picture emerging and a steady decline from the mid-2020s. And by 2050, the emissions would be about 40% below the current levels. And that is pretty significant finding because for 200 years now, since the Industrial Revolution, global fossil fuel CO2 emissions have always grown every single decade. So if the announced pledges were to be implemented, then 2030 would mark the first decade since the Industrial Revolution where fossil fuel emissions ended the decade lower than they started. And that's despite the huge downward shock of the COVID pandemic. However, we published this in October, and since mid-October, we have more countries seen making new pledges. So, for example, Indian Prime Minister strengthened the country's 2030 target and pledged to hit net zero emissions by 2070. And if we take this announcement and other announcements into account, sorry, I forgot to mention the Methane Pledge. It's quite an important outcome of the COP26, which also one of these new targets we take into account in the updated APS. So the updated analysis shows that if they are met in full and in time, it would be enough to hold the rise in global temperature to 1.8 degrees by the end of the century. And that's really a landmark moment because it is the first time ever that governments have come forward with targets that are sufficiently ambitious to hold global warming below 2 degrees. So let's have a look what that means for the global energy markets. So under stated policies, excuse me, under stated policies, energy demand continues to grow, and the next decade would look pretty much like the last decade. So the share of fossil fuels in the global energy mix would decline, but only very slightly, from 79% today to 75% by the end of this decade in steps. So for example, looking at oil here on the left side, in steps, global demand would already exceed pre-pandemic levels in 2023. However, under announced pledges, the global energy market is really reshaped. And by 2030, the share of unabated fossil fuels would decline to 72% of the global energy mix. So in this APS, oil peaks in 2025 and then flattens. And much of this change is really explained by the changing trends in the use of cars, or the oil use for cars. So we see that for cars in particular, net zero pledges are really often backed up by specific policies. So we have 34 countries today that have set policies or targets to stop the sales for internal combustion engine vehicles, for example, like the European Union or Canada by in the year 35. So that's on oil, and from where it's on gas, gas reaches its maximum level soon after 2025 and then flattens in the APS. And this is mostly explained by the power sector, especially in countries with net zero targets. Natural gas loses market shares with the growing role of solar PV and wind, which we see on the right side. So announced pledges really further accelerate the uptake of solar PV and wind by so much that their growth would keep up with the entire growth of electricity demand over the next decade. And that would raise their share of generation from 10% today to nearly 30% in 2030. So by the end of this decade, solar PV and wind would both overtake natural gas and coal. Let's have a closer look at coal, because coal is really the source of over 40% of all energy-related CO2 emissions today. So the good news is that we saw a 4% record drop in 2020, but the bad news is that coal use in 2021 has rebounded very strongly. And coal-fired power plants alone make up 30% of global energy-related emissions today. So addressing these existing emissions is really a top priority for the clean energy transition. And the first task is phasing out coal is stopping the construction of new plants because these could lock in electricity generation and emission for decades. However, the construction of new coal-fired power plants has actually been on the rise for decades now, and there was more coal added in the last decade than ever before. Looking forward, there are still 140 gigawatt of new coal plants under construction worldwide, and 3 times that much planned. So while announced pledges could cancel like 20% of these planned plants, 350 gigawatt would still be built in the decades ahead. But there are some opportunities to move the needle. So for example, at the UN General Assembly in September, China pledged to stop building new coal plants abroad. And that could cancel up to 190 gigawatts over the next 30 years. And it could reduce the related CO2 emissions by about 20 gigatons up to 2050. And to put that into perspective, that's comparable to the reductions in the entire EU goes net zero. So if this opportunity is fully realized, then this decade would be the last one with new unabated coal-fired power plants. However, it's not just about stopping new construction, but also addressing the emissions of the existing fleet, because we have over 9,000 coal plants in operation today, and they're located in 100 different countries, so it's a really complex task. Together, they emit almost 10 gigatons of CO2 in 2020. If they continue to operate as they did in the past, then they would emit 250 gigatons of CO2 over the next 30 years. And as you can see on the chart, that makes up already half of the remaining CO2 budget to 1.5 degrees. So it's very important to not only look at ways to cut emissions from coal plants, but also limiting the associated job impacts and contribute to the transition while maintaining security. So we propose 3 main ways in which we can do that. First, retrofitting with carbon capture and storage, or co-firing with biomass or ammonia. We can repurpose the coal-fired power plants, for example, to focus on system flexibility. And lastly, we can retire them early, and that presents opportunities to convert them, for example, into renewable energy projects or storage facilities. So looking back at emissions, the last few slides have shown that despite the progress we saw in the APS, there's still a substantial gap to the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. And meeting the Paris Agreement's objective of 1.5 degrees, that requires net zero emissions in 2050. We see in this pathway. And this gap is particularly large in the short term, in 2030, because near-term action really lags behind the pace that we would need to see in the NZE scenario. So in 2030, the announced pledges scenario closes only 20% of the gap between the steps and the NZE. And that leaves an ambition gap of 14 gigatons. So this indicates that all countries need to step up their ambitions if we want to close the gap. And there's a real risk that if we delay this near-term action, we really put net zero emissions by 2050 completely out of reach, because it would leave us with too much to do after 2030 and with too much emissions locked in and too little progress in innovation and clean energy technologies. So the focus should really be on near-term action. So let's look at how we can close this gap. As I mentioned, we are left with an ambition gap in 2030 of 14 gigatons that need to be closed to put us on a net zero pathway. The good news is that we found in our analysis that we can close a large share of this gap cost effectively. So with measures that are well understood, we can close 40% of the remaining gap with measures that are cost effective. So that means no additional cost to governments or consumers. So what are these measures exactly? They are listed below here on the chart. And to get into that, we estimate that 60% of additional generation from wind and solar required to close the gap in the electricity sector could be achieved cost effectively So this would avoid 2.3 gigatons of CO2. That's equivalent to 15% already of the gap. More than half a gigaton additionally can be avoided with other cost-effective measures in the power sector, such as hydropower or nuclear. Another very cost-effective measure we see here on the chart is reducing fossil fuel methane leaks. And I will skip a little bit over the other measures you see on this slide, so we keep the time. But just to mention that apart from the cost-effective measures, you might wonder, what about the other 60%? So these are mainly measures that reduce demand beyond cost-effective efficiency, such as material efficiency in industry, but also importantly, behavior changes. So I get to that now on my last slide. So behavior changes is what I personally focus on in the WEO team. And the IEA net zero emission scenario, we call for very profound transformations in every corner of the global energy system. And we found that technology is not enough to achieve that. Net zero emissions in 2050 cannot happen without the consent and the active support of people. So I would like to mention 3 reasons why behavior changes are necessary and important. The first one is they're necessary to address locked-in emissions from carbon-intensive assets. So clean energy technologies are adopted at a really unprecedented speed in the NZE, but still it doesn't happen overnight. So we will still be using carbon-intensive assets for a while, such as gas boilers or ICE cars. And if we use them less frequently or less intensively, that offers really a shortcut to rapid emission reductions. So in this scenario, behavior changes such as driving more slowly on motorways or restricting the use of conventional vehicles in cities would cut emissions from road transport by 15%. That's roughly equivalent to all emissions from international shipping today. And similarly, another example, setting your thermostat at home or in an office to maximum 20 degrees Celsius, that reduces cumulative emissions from existing stock of fossil fuel boilers by 10% until 2030, which really allows time, much needed time for clean heating retrofits to take place. So achieving the same emission reductions in end users without behavior changes would require ramping up low carbon technologies at a much faster speed. So, for example, almost half of all cars on the road in 2030 would need to be electric, and that means that the sales of electric cars would need to reach almost 100% within just the next 5 years, from just around 4% today. So we really win time with behavior changes. Another reason why they are important is they address emissions in hard-to-abate sectors. So in some sectors, low-carbon technologies are not well developed or really costly to deploy. That's particularly true for aviation. So we modeled what, for example, reducing business travel or long-haul holidays, like over 6 hours of flying, could achieve predominantly in advanced economies. This would save around 170 megatons of CO2, just equivalent to 40% of the remaining emissions from aviation in 2050. And thirdly, and lastly, behavior changes reduce demand simply, and thus takes pressure off new sources of low carbon electricity. And it really helps to keep biofuels production also within sustainable limits. So as you can see on the chart, under announced pledges, we really see very limited behavior changes. In the NZE, they go much further. But they don't just happen like that. They must be incentivized by policy. So we found that around 70% of the measures mentioned here would need to be underpinned by government policy. So most of them don't really affect your lifestyle. A lot of this is mode switching or reducing excess and waste. But we also model some foregoing, like I mentioned, for long-haul leisure holidays. And with that, I finish my part of the presentation and hand over to Martin. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Leonie. I'm sharing my screen. Yes. Okay, perfect. So in the second part of the presentation, I will focus on two topics. First of all, I will dive more deep into the industry sector. After Leonie's deep dive on behavior, I will present the deep dive of my area of expertise. And then afterwards, I will give a more broad picture of how our scenarios affect the global energy economy and what are the consequences for different parts of this economy. Maybe shortly on the industry sector. So in general, our modeling is divided in the supply side and the demand side. And in the demand side, we take the approach from end use demands. So we take the approach from the kilometers persons travel, from the tons of materials that are produced, or from the space where people live and where they need heating, electricity, and appliances. So we really try to go from the end use demand. And here I wrote a graph about the industry sector. The industry sector is particularly interesting. It currently makes up for 40% of the total final consumption and emits around 8.7 gigatons of CO2 today, which makes it the second largest emitting sector after the power generation. And particularly in the industry sector, we have several industrial processes that are really hard to abate. So, for example, in cement production, we need coal, or we also have process emissions, for example, from limestones. So it's really hard to abate emissions from the industry sector. To reach a net zero pathway now, and you see the difference for each sector between the APS and the NZE scenario. Emissions need to be reduced by 2.8 gigatons until 2030. This is across all sectors, mainly in the most emitting sectors, iron and steel and cement. And until 2030, we mainly have three levers to reach that, which are the material efficiency, the general energy efficiency, and the electrification of processes. Those are also part of the cost-effective measures that Leonie mentioned until 2030, and they can be quick fixes in the industry sector. One example for material efficiency and the difference between an NZE world and an APS world is to go also in the construction industry and use, for example, less steel for the production of materials. And this change is then also reflected in the final energy consumption of fuels. In the right side, you see that in the NZE scenario, the demand is lower than in the APS. We have a higher share of electricity demand, lower shares of gas, oil, and coal demand. Another interesting point of the right side is that the demand for CCUS or hydrogen is still quite low in 2030. And we also did a deep dive analysis in the World Energy Outlook last year about the iron and steel industry and found out that especially for those two technologies, hydrogen and CCUS, they are much more cost competitive after 2030. So right now we stress the need for research and development, for pilot projects, demonstration projects to really ramp up these technologies and be cost competitive as soon as possible, latest by 2030, to go then to the second stage of the industrial decarbonization. Also, of course, we need other policy instruments to maintain a fair competition and to avoid that higher costs to develop these technologies lead to disadvantages in the global competition. After the industry sector, I would like now to switch to the more global view of the new energy economy. And I would like to start with international trade first. Currently, international trade is dominated by oil. Since last year, we also started to monitor critical minerals, which will also be a part of this presentation now. Critical minerals are currently especially used as of copper for electrical grids, which make already 11% of the global trade. In our announced pledges scenario until 2050, the share of oil maintains constant or quite similar. The picture doesn't change much for oil. The main reason is that even though we see a phase out of oil in some countries, regions like the European Union or China, we see a ramp up in other regions, especially developing Asia. So we see a change of flow from the Middle East to Europe, to the Middle East to developing Asia. And this implies, of course, new policy dependencies and new relationships worldwide. A second new element next to the increase of critical minerals is hydrogen. Hydrogen is specifically considered for trade because the production costs vary around the world. And our scenario shows that we see particularly a trade from regions in which hydrogen can be generated, produced at very low cost to other regions. Particularly of interest are Australia, Middle East, Latin America. So by 2050, in our announced pledges scenario, which only considers current net zero pledges, hydrogen trade is already higher than coal. Then in the net zero scenario, the trade flows are completely overturned. We have around 80% combined share of critical minerals and hydrogen. Especially the demand of critical minerals increases significantly to build batteries, to build PV panels, wind power plants, and so on. So these critical minerals are really important, and also the demand for critical minerals shows that the geopolitical considerations around energy are continuing to be important, but may change since these critical minerals are not necessarily in the same regions as we find coal, oil, and gas in current markets. The transformation of the energy system is, of course, motivated by the fight against climate change, but there are also economical benefits of this change. So we see commercial industrial employment gains in our scenario. Currently, of course, the estimated market size is of the oil industry, which is our reference here, is much higher than for clean tech. Clean tech, we include fuel cells, electrolyzers, battery packs, wind turbines, and solar PV modules. But if the world gets on track on our exemplary net zero roadmap until 2050, the cumulative market until 2050 adds up to 27 trillion US dollar in this net zero pathway for these 5 equipment markets. And this is by 2050, the market size would then be equivalent to the oil economy today, which shows the huge impact and the huge market opportunity that is there in place. Of course, this would again revamp all global supply chains, but it's a growing market for sure. And this growing market also goes in hand with new employment opportunities. We see that until 2030, there are already almost 30 million new clean energy jobs created in our net zero scenario. And these 30 million jobs are far more than the jobs that are lost from fossil fuels. So in total, we see a gain of new jobs, new opportunities. Of course, an important point is to train people to enable them for these jobs. But in total, we see a job growth by this new global energy economy. After the general economy, I would like to turn now to investments. And in the wheel, the investments are always an important point to track. How were the investments in the future? Which investments are needed for the next years to come on track of our scenarios? In the case of oil and gas, upstream investment has halved in the last years. This was on the one side also an effect of the COVID pandemic, of course. But even though demand has been stable, investment has decreased, which shows that the industry has somehow is very effective, has learned to do more with less. So increase the efficiency of all processes along the value chain. With regard to our net zero scenario and the investments that are needed between 2022 and 2030, the current investments are in place, in line with this scenario. So from the oil and gas side, we could say we are on a good track to a net zero scenario. On the other side, we see the clean energy investments, which are increasing from 2018 onwards. And we estimate a slight uptake also this year. But while the oil and gas investments, as I said, are in line with our roadmap, the clean energy investments have to more than triple to get on this track. And this shows again the real need for all stakeholders to invest in these technologies and to push for the energy transitions. One important point also to notice, also in the current context of unstable energy markets, is that we need both sides to be at the top of the columns for the roadmap. So if we invest enough in oil and gas production, but not enough in clean energy transition, then we will for sure see turbulences and create risks for security of supply in the future, because we face down or we do not build enough new oil and gas production facilities, but we also are not building enough renewable infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure. So both values need to be reached. Investment, especially in clean energy and infrastructure investment, has to increase to position a very secure energy transition and not to lead to insecure energy markets. Then another important point, focusing more on the critical minerals and hydrogen, is their share in the global trade and also their impact on the cost of the energy transition. So in the past years, we have seen a cost decrease of many technologies: solar, PV, wind, batteries. We have seen significant decreases due to economies of scale, learning rates, and this has boosted a lot the deployment of these technologies. This cost decrease also leads to the fact that the share of critical mineral in the technology costs increases. So price shocks of critical minerals have a much higher effect on the deployment of these costs. And we have simulated the price shocks in our scenario, and we see that the impact is between 5% and 15% on the prices. So yeah, in overall, the market demand and prices for critical minerals play an important role, and too high prices can for sure endanger either the speed or the investment costs required for the energy transition need to be monitored. And again, the geopolitical configuration of these critical minerals markets need also to be monitored and lead to very new relationships globally that the IEA will continue to monitor. Then also, we again in the current situation of very high energy prices, we also monitored in our scenarios how price shocks of fossil fuels affect household spendings. So what you see here between 2016 and 2020 is an average value for household energy bills. It's interesting also how this is composed. Around half of this slightly more than $1,000 US are oil products, so especially petroleum for cars, and then 1/3 is for electricity, appliances, air conditioners, and so on, and then also especially in the western or northern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, also spending goes to gas for heating. I guess in the UK and also here in Paris, you recognize that this gas is required. So this is kind of the composition of these household spendings. In the steps, these spendings rise by 15%. This is mostly due to increasing oil and gas prices, slightly increasing. The composition, the different shares of the bills are not fundamentally changed and are very similar to the current bills. In our net zero scenario, the general bills decrease. This has many different regions. The main word is efficiency. So appliances are more efficient, buildings are more energy efficient, the mobility is more efficient, heat pumps are used, which are more efficient than, for example, a gas heater. And by this efficiency, costs can be decreased by 30% compared by 30%. Then we evaluated how the price shock of oil, natural gas, and coal affects these energy bills. And due to the much lower dependency on fossil fuels in the net zero scenario, the impact is, of course, much less than compared to the stated policy scenario. And this is also an important message in the current energy crisis. So the current price shocks we see are not due to the energy transition, but the energy transition can reduce those price shocks. So we urge that there need to be a significant amount of additional investments in the electrification technologies, but also in energy efficiency. And this can help to reduce price shocks, dependency on fossil fuels, and also be effective in household bills. Lastly, we would like to mention the effect of extreme weather events. Also last year around the world, we have seen significant weather events. And just to show you some numbers, around 1/4 of electricity networks are endangered by cyclone winds. 10%, around 10% of thermal power plants or refineries are endangered by coastal flooding, or water stress is a major issue for more than half of all copper mines. And these are only 3 exemplary examples of weather events. Of course, we have heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and these all increase with climate change. And we need to monitor all of these aspects as well to consider the resilience of our energy systems in the meantime of happening global climate change. By this, I would like to conclude. A first very important point, again, is that the transition to a sustainable energy system is the solution to the turbulence that we are seeing in gas, coal, and electricity markets today. It's not the cause. We will decrease our dependency on fossil fuels by a cleaner energy system. Then Leonie mentioned the cost effectiveness of technologies. So a laser-like focus on clean energy, clean electrification, energy efficiency, methane abatement, and innovation can close the near-term gap with a 1.5-degree future. These solutions are available and are cost effective, and the countries just need to step up on these. Then we showed that a new global energy economy is emerging. It will be more electrified, efficient, digital, and clean, and offers an enormous potential for growth and employment for new markets. And the last thing is that the governments need or see the capacity to transform the energy sector. And now from Glasgow, after Glasgow, there need to be a wave of investment driven by governments to get to this net zero pathway. By this, I would like to thank you and would be very interested in your questions. Leonie and me will be happy to answer them in the next minutes. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for that, Martin, Leonie. That was really interesting. So we now have time for some questions. So we've had a couple submitted already, but if anybody else has any questions, please just put them in the comment section on Facebook or YouTube, and hopefully we'll have time to get around to them. So we'll start with this question that was submitted. So how would you model the rate of R&D for different types of technology, as this would be the foundation of deciding how much we can reduce the rate of this transition?
Martin, if you want, I can have a go at these first two, and you can jump in if you want to add anything. So how we model R&D, that depends on the type of scenario we look at. As I mentioned, we have normative ones and we have exploratory ones. So in the exploratory ones, we really track carefully investment in R&D and project with our model where this will take us. But in terms of how much R&D is needed to get where we want to get in a net zero emission scenario, for example, it's true that this is a really crucial element. So I have shown in the slide with the emissions showing the net zero trajectory that the short term gap is particularly large, and I've also spoken about the cost effectiveness of closing this gap, and that 60% in 2030 would not yet be cost effective. And this is mostly about measures that do require a lot of R&D, such as hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, advanced batteries, advanced biofuels. But it's really important to emphasize that despite them being not cost effective yet in 2030, the focus must be on investing in R&D for them right now, because otherwise you will not have them available sufficiently after 2030. So depending on the scenario, we either model like upwards or downwards, or and assess how much investment in R&D in these technologies is needed. And Martin had shown some slides on that there's a massive gap between the investment we currently see and the investment needed in NZE. I would move to the second question, or Martin, would you want to add on this question on R&D?
Maybe a quick addition on that is that we also monitor detailed for each technology, like how mature it is already today. So by that we can also derive which specific technologies are already mature and mature to go to the market, or which technologies need more R&D, are maybe more in a demonstration pilot phase, and this also helps us in this context.
Right. Yeah, we track technology readiness levels. Yeah. The second question I see is on the economic and technological feasibility for developing in emerging countries. So really important here to note is that the question focuses on oil, but generally the shift away from fossil fuels can bring about huge benefits, especially for poorer communities. Martin has shown the impact on household income. So we see that in the NZE pathway, a much lower share of household income is going to energy than in the steps. And that's especially true for emerging and developing economies. However, this is often tied to electrification or efficiency improvements, things like retrofits that enable a shift away from fossil fuels. And these require upfront investments. And that is mostly challenging for emerging and developing economies. So finance is really the big question here. And cost of public finance is up to 7 times higher for emerging economies and for advanced economies. So a really big focus must be on mobilizing private investment in emerging economies. We estimate that to achieve the investment levels needed in NZE, around 60% of this would have to be mobilized from the private sector. So, yeah, Martin, you want to add on that, or?
Not much to add from my side. Just maybe as a disclaimer that we are looking at the system globally. So we do not like, we also urge for the investments in developing economies from industrial countries to support on this transition, and for a fair transition also between different regions in the world, because of course countries are developed differently, also emission footprints are differently. So we always encourage that this transition needs to be fair. Should I go on the next one, Leonie?
Yeah, that would be great.
Was wondering, since the IEA Net Zero 2050 is more of a guideline and recommendation, how do you think countries, companies would react to and follow these recommendations? That's a very good question, because of course that's always crucial that in the end countries or companies follow it. In the Net Zero 2050, which was, as Leonie presented, in a standalone report, and in the WIO we just compared it to the current pledges. But in the report we have published more than 200, I think, milestones, and these milestones are very concrete to reach this net zero pathway. And we also stress here that this pathway is one pathway. It's not the only pathway. There are several pathways, but it's one pathway which could lead the world to net zero. And these milestones can be used concretely by countries, by companies, to transform to net zero. We have seen several countries or companies already referencing these milestones in lawmaking processes or in new country programs for energy efficiency. Germany recently announced their plan, how the new government wants to transform the industry sector, and the first 2 pages were about these milestones. So these milestones make it more traceable and more, kind of trackable than just the scenario.
Thanks a lot, Martin. If you want, I can take the next one on hydrogen. We do model different types of hydrogen. So you mentioned green hydrogen, so hydrogen produced from clean electricity, but we also consider blue hydrogen, which is fossil fuel-based hydrogen equipped with carbon capture and storage. So we do include both of these because taking any option off the table at this stage really reduces our chances of meeting emission targets. And hydrogen from fossil fuels with carbon capture, it can have advantages in certain regions in terms of the cost and scale, especially for industrial assets. And important to note that we have certain conditions in play in our model to consider blue hydrogen. So hydrogen produced from fossil fuels with CCUS, it needs to meet 3 conditions in order to be considered for low carbon hydrogen. So carbon capture must be applied to all CO2 streams associated with the production route at really high capture rates, and the CO2 must be permanently stored. And thirdly, the upstream methane must be minimized. Also to note that in some countries, operating electrolyzers are using electricity with today's grid would actually produce more emissions than using a natural gas. So we really look at the specific circumstances in play, and it depends on if the use of that hydrogen would increase or reduce the current emissions, for example, by replacing coal.
Thank you so much for that. So I think that's all the questions we've had so far, unless anybody wants to submit another one in the past few minutes. In the next few minutes, we do have a few minutes left if anybody would like to submit a question. So, okay, we've not had anything through yet, but so thank you so much, Martin and Leonie, for joining us today on behalf of everybody watching. I'm sure everybody will have found it as interesting as I did. Oh, we've had another question. So this will probably be our last question, but what is the role of CCS in your modeling?
Should I go for it, Leonie, as industry?
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah, CCS has, of course, an important role for the modeling, especially in the net zero by 2050 scenario, because I mentioned in the presentation on the industry sector, there are certain processes in the production process of basic materials that are not able to be abated, and therefore we need CCS. In our NZD scenario, we also benchmarked how much CCS is required compared to other scenarios, and we are more on the lower end, so more conservative with CCS compared, for example, to IPCC. But of course, it is an important lever for the net zero roadmap, particularly in the industry sector, chemical or cement production, but also, for example, it can be a point for power plants. And also CCS can be a solution to avoid stranded assets or lock in emissions by upgrading existing fleets with CCS.
Yeah,
Great.
maybe. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't realize you had more to add. Go for it.
No, just Martin said most about it. Just to mention that we often hear that it's like an unproven technology and we rely too much on CCUS, but in fact, it's not an unproven technology. It's just at the moment relatively expensive. But there are already around 40 megatons of CO2 captured and several projects in the pipeline. So it's really about the scaling of this technology to bring down the price. And there is another question on behavior change. We still have time.
Yeah,
Happy
this
to
will probably
take
be
that
the
one.
last one.
Sure. Yes, well, in my opinion, it's actually not so hard to bring about behavior changes, because looking into the history, it has happened, and it has happened on really unimaginable scales. Usually behavior change seems unimaginable for people at the moment, but then it's human nature to really get used to new ways of living really fast. So when you think back of how normal it was, like the example of smoking in the public, for example, there was a big opposition to this kind of behavior change. But once the ban was in place, like nowadays it's absolutely unimaginable for people to, in many countries at least, to smoke in indoor places next to someone eating. It's just an example of how quickly humans are able to change their perceptions of what's normal behavior and what's not. And the policy tools at the hands of governments are really vast. There are many policy options available. We have financial incentives, nudging, information campaigns, and then importantly, infrastructure investment. So as long as governments provide an alternative that doesn't impact the standard of living, people in surveys show that they are really open to behavior change. Actually, there's a big support for most proposed changes. The big thing it all really depends on is the aspect of fairness. So, for example, when we look at flying, most people don't really support a really high general tax on flying, because then the 1% of people that cause most aviation emissions would still fly because they can afford it. But really high shares of people in most countries do support something like a frequent flyer levy, where really the frequent flyers are taxed more. So most behavior changes are actually easy to bring about as long as governments really design the policies in a smart and fair way. That would be my answer to that.
Great, thank you so much. That brings us to 6:30, so I suppose we'll be ending here. So thank you so much, Martin and Leonie, for your talk and for answering our questions. Thank you to everybody who's watching and for the questions you submitted. And yeah, everybody have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us. It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Have a good evening.
Bye.